Hi everyone, I hope you can hear us. Welcome to the May meeting of Space Iceland. With us today is Berenike Vollmer, and we're quite excited about this talk for two reasons. First of all, her research is incredibly interesting and I think gives one of the better overview of NATO's infrastructure. And also, it's the last meeting before summer starts. So there aren't really too many announcements. We usually do announcements from Space Iceland before. Obviously, you received the announcement about me taking a part-time role in Transparency International, along with my duties here at Space Iceland. As you know, it will not affect the work here. We are making some headlines with the CubeSat, which we hope to be able to announce soon. And next month, we'll have 9 student researchers joining us. So that's going to be interesting. So we are tripling in size. But I think that's it for now. And I just want to ask Berenike to start. Thank you.
Yeah, hi Thor, and thank you so much for doing the introduction. Very excited for you to be here today and really excited for everyone who joined. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce a little bit my work on this topic. As I understood it, this will be recorded and later distributed online. So excited to have the link on that as well. Yeah, I hope you can see my screen just fine. Yes? Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. As Thor was announcing, I will be speaking today about a rather specific topic, which are NATO's mission-critical space capabilities under threat, the cybersecurity gaps in the military space asset supply chain. So basically what I did for this work, it was within the framework of my master thesis here at Sciences Po in Paris, and I conducted it together with the NATO Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense in Tallinn, and conducted 19 very high-level interviews within the private and the public sector to gather all the information which I needed. Specifically, I looked at the NATO military supply chain, but as well the different capabilities which were built up in the public and private sectors of NATO's member states. And as we will see, there are quite a lot of them. So my basic hypothesis was that data obtained from those space assets is obviously fundamental for NATO, as any hostile cyber operation would severely impact both NATO's missions and the national security of its member states. However, as NATO satellites or the satellites provided by the member states and used by NATO majorly rely on commercial parts, the threat, a huge cybersecurity threat exists there and is exacerbated by NATO's mostly unregulated space asset supply chain. I will get into that in a second. So the research questions which formed the basis for this thesis and for this research were A, what are current cybersecurity gaps along this global space asset supply chain? And B, how can NATO and its allied member states gain greater control over such gaps? To find out about that, I conducted those 19 high-level interviews and found quite some interesting answers. To just start with the whole topic, NATO's use of space. What does NATO actually use those satellites for? There are 3 big areas, I would call them. The first one is obviously satellite communications. From what I heard throughout the interviews, This field is the most important one for NATO because obviously on the ground in the field, you need the telecommunications such as broadband internet, mobile services, beyond line of sight communications, which gets especially important these days in the Arctic. Then intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, we need those satellites, or NATO needs those satellites and information retrieved from it for multispectral information on the subsurface, on the surface, and in the air. And finally, positioning, navigation, timing. NATO's personnel is obviously extremely reliant on precise navigation services. This includes GPS, Galileo, or obviously EGNOS. So with that comes the precise timing, vital to the military operations. Looking at the cybersecurity gaps, which are opened when you are using, which are there when you're using those satellite capabilities. Taking the space assets, and I'm sure, Tor, obviously this will come at no surprise to you, you can structure them into three major parts, which would be the ground segment, the space segment, and the data link segment. So analyzing cybersecurity gaps within the ground segment and the space segment, we could observe that there were quite a number of cybersecurity attacks on the soft and the hardware. So given the fact that both the public and the private sector use partially legacy software, given the fact that if you put the satellite up into orbit, then it might just remain there for 10 to 15 years, and it's basically impossible to go up and fix the hardware which is up there. Whereas attacks are just developing from day to day down here on Earth. So hacking into the software or into the hardware is relatively easy from what I read throughout the research and from what I heard throughout the interviews. So we would have interception and malware attacks such as phishing, spear phishing, obviously ransomware, identity theft, social engineering, or denial of service. There's quite a lot of very interesting literature out there on these topics and on past attacks. I really recommend you to go through it. It's very interesting and partially frightening from what could happen there. As I was hinting towards earlier when connecting the ground segment and the space segment, more and more companies are using commercial out-of-the-shelf technology, which is produced typically in a rather unregulated environment. And also from what I heard throughout the interviews is not always encrypted within the data, or the data which is transmitted is not always encrypted, which obviously opens up more space for cybersecurity attacks. Finally, another cybersecurity gap which I identified there is the organizational handling of the whole connection. So throughout NATO, there's still not sufficient expertise on the whole subject. And also there's a reluctance of NATO member states governments to report cyber attacks partially due to a deterrence reason. So in admitting that there would be those cyber attacks, obviously member states would reveal their potential or their individual vulnerabilities for which hackers might go after. Beside of that, within NATO, positions directed at space-related assets are currently double to triple-headed. So right now there was opened a new, or it's envisaged to open, that there will be opened a new space center of excellence in Germany, which is quite exciting. However, up to the point that I wrote this thesis, which was up to December, the expertise was still lacking within NATO, but as well throughout the national government, which then hindered them to give those experts to NATO. And one of the most important points, obviously, is that on an international space, there is still no sufficient regulation of the state and non-state actors. Especially non-state actors are still not really bound in their production of space assets, and not quite regulated when it comes to giving those capabilities to an international framework such as NATO. So within NATO, within the NATO treaty, there is Article 5, which would be the right to collective defense if one of those space capabilities would be attacked. However, some scholars hinted to the fact that NATO Article 5 might just be hindered by NATO Article 6, which is incongruent with space and cyberspace. So within NATO Article 6, it states that attacks must be conducted on the national area of a state. However, space and cyberspace are obviously not framed by state or non-state borders. So this is a specific particularity given or hindering NATO in striking back if there are attacks against the cyberspace or outer space capabilities. Yeah, coming to the big subject of the thesis, the cyber supply chain of those space assets. Why does NATO actually rely on this supply chain, and what are vulnerabilities within the supply chain? So one would be the dependency on those unregulated, unsecured dual-use assets. So as I said earlier, NATO depends majorly on the member states' space assets, which retrieve them from the commercial sector. NATO itself had 8 satellites up until the 1990s, which are still out there in outer space, but are not really used anymore because the commercial sector was obviously way more innovative, way more rapid in development. The monetary resources are just there, which are not yet there in an international organization such as NATO. So monetary resources are quite restricted, and as I said earlier, expertise as well. Those which are there are highly competent from all the talks that I had with them, but using the private sector and using commercial resources proved quite valuable to military organizations. However, putting that on the, or translating that on cyber supply chain vulnerabilities, there arises obviously the question on liability and responsibility in case of a supply chain cyber attack. So if there is no such international framework, judicial framework, which would be also quite hard to infer on the different member states and on the private sector, who is responsible if there happens to be an attack on the satellites. Then the second point is market pressure. As I just said, the commercial market is rapid in development and rapid in innovation. So NATO in itself also needs to stay competitive and thus deterrent against other states, other individual states and other allied states. I'm just hinting here towards, for example, very strong Russian developments in the field and also Chinese developments. So the need to adapt and the need to stay competitive and thus deterrent is just higher and weighted more importantly than the focus on cybersecurity. Classification restrictions. Throughout the interviews, it became quite clear that there is a limited sharing of essential threat intelligence. As I was saying earlier, nation states themselves are quite reluctant to share their vulnerabilities and potential attacks which happened on state-used satellites due to given reasons. But however, as well, in the private sector, it's the same case. Private sector companies are so far quite reluctant to share their cybersecurity gaps and to share their entry points for vulnerabilities, so that the dialogue between commercial companies and between commercial companies and states and governments, and obviously therefore NATO, is extremely restricted. There are few international sharing platforms already for cybersecurity vulnerabilities themselves, but then coming to the whole satellite issue, which is the basis, the major fundamental part for critical infrastructure, so safeguarding, for example, water supply, energy supply, GPS, all of that is still extremely restricted. Lacking awareness. As I said earlier, there are little experts in the field, and therefore there's also a great lack of risk management training throughout the organizations, throughout NATO, throughout the private sector, throughout the national governments. And therefore, there's a lack of organizational overview and thus performance during crisis, such as COVID. So from what I heard from several members of the space community is that especially during COVID, the willingness to spend more money into cybersecurity gaps rapidly shrunk, as the companies, and especially some of the smaller space asset companies, developers, were rather investing their money in staying operational. And then we have challenges such as artificial intelligence coming up, opening up a whole new field of ethical questions, of possibilities to intrude into foreign space assets and to analyze and collect data. So this is a whole new future field coming up now, which obviously then needs to be regulated as well. And then significant understaffing, as I was saying, there's still lack of coordination, a lack of resources, and the willingness to focus on the cybersecurity enhancement, with space expert positions being double to triple-headed throughout the organizations. Yes, having identified all of those cybersecurity lacks and vulnerabilities, there are quite some recommendations, measures that the individual governments, but as well NATO's, can take up to enhance the whole situation and to safeguard their supply chain. So basically, those recommendations can be divided into two bigger fields, which would be A, awareness, and B, regulation. On the awareness side, there is quite basically the need for a bigger intersectoral collaboration. That's nothing new. Public-private partnerships is not a new term per se. However, looking at the nexus between cybersecurity and space assets and supply chain, there is, as I said, no such thing, or no very established sharing of information going on so far. So this is the first and very fundamental requirement to safeguard this potential threat field of threats. Increased engagement, increased expertise. So as I said, the new NATO Center of Excellence for Space is coming up right now, which is amazing, because this means more resources will go into military space assets, and therefore it's their safeguarding. Mission-specific cyber space asset supply chain risk assessments. For each NATO mission, it should become a basic requirement to specifically analyze what space assets are used, what is NATO or what are the troops depending upon, what member states are they relying upon to do so, and then in response to this analysis, develop a resilience framework, and try to safeguard against those vulnerabilities already in advance. And then obviously as well exercising this risk management. So for example, NIST, and that's what I will talk about in the second field as well, the regulations as well, is that NIST, the one of the biggest cybersecurity framework organizations internationally, already developed quite a lot of recommendations for cybersecurity risk management, which could be easily adopted for space assets as well, and for the space asset supply chain, as a lot of member states already apply them and already agreed on them either way. So one could take them up and make them compulsory for when acquiring space assets and space asset services. So yeah, which leads directly to the second big field, regulation. The first big measure here to take would be to streamline the security and classification levels. So it might become necessary to declassify some of the data which is retrieved from the space assets, and then as well therefore to make it possible to share this data throughout the different organizations and throughout the different nation states, and to streamline the classification requirements within NATO, but then as well to the different member states. This goes along with technical requirements, with how do you transfer the data, which data formats do you use. So at the moment, those are still quite differing, which makes it hard for NATO to work with the data retrieved from the member states, which was one point which was emphasized upon throughout a lot of interviews, actually. There should be a standardized public-private security framework for the contract requirements. So when NATO, or the moment that NATO starts to receive data from commercial vendors, it should have like a standardized framework for the contracts, which was taken up upon right now by the US government. So as we can see with the CMMC, the cybersecurity maturity model, which was just developed in the United States, the US DoD just took up a huge effort to safeguard its supply chains, which is quite a difficult task to do, considering all the commercial vendors and all the commercial suppliers delivering services to the DoD throughout the whole supply chain tiers. However, it is, like, from my point of view, the only way to safeguard this supply chain and to actually have an overview over who is involved there throughout this whole space asset universe that NATO is relying upon. A mandatory report of all cyber breaches. I think this is critical to start to be able to just analyze where are vulnerabilities coming from, who is relying upon them, and how were they caused, let's say. Yeah, then those key terms substitute security by obscurity by security by design and default. Quite an important point emphasized upon by a lot of military and private sector actors, not trying to repair the breaches afterwards, but trying to start already with safe and secure soft and hardware, which goes hand in hand with procurement contracts, based on frameworks such as NIST, such as the CMMC requirements. And then, yes, this leads to adopting industry standards and procedures into supplier contracts. So what I was hearing quite a lot throughout the whole research was that it is not necessary and also not desired that NATO starts to develop its own standards throughout the whole supply chain or for the private sector, because within the private sector, and especially also in the financial sector, there are already quite a lot of frameworks which could be adopted and which then could be used for this nexus between the private and the public sphere. Yes, and that's where I conclude the whole research. Happy to take up your questions if you have some. And thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so what we usually do now is just take some questions and have a chat. I see there is a question from Yelena in Lithuania. Do you want to ask it yourself, Yelena, so we can? Yeah.
Sure, I can do that. No worries. Maybe I will start firstly by saying thank you so much for your presentation. It's really fascinating, and it seems like, well, my first question relates to something a little bit more, I think, common in terms of NATO and cybersecurity gaps, but this is something of a new avenue, which I think not people talk about. And so maybe I will start with my second question about the space assets, and in particular, has there been any sort of notable cyber attacks? If yes, by like which states, or this is more of sort of an anticipation of these threats that we should be concerned about these gaps?
Yeah, Jelena, thank you so much for your question. That's indeed a very important and relevant question. There have been quite a lot of attacks already using space assets and using attacks on the data link to satellites. So, for example, what I would very much recommend is, I see Gregory, for example, Gregory Falco is today here as well. Hi, and thank you for joining in. He wrote an amazing article on hackers potentially attacking satellites. There are quite some examples in there. On the Nato notes, there have been attacks on CubeSats, so like really like micro satellites, let's say, used very near to Earth, which are more easily attackable due to the software links and their commercial linkage on Earth. So yes, there have been quite a lot of attacks. And wait, let me quickly look at the second part of your question. Yeah, so those threats, how have they been addressed? So as I was saying earlier, it is hard to say how many threats have happened, and it's hard to say how they have been addressed in response. But one thing that we can be sure of is that there was oftentimes a big silence, or oftentimes a big effort to not address them at all. Because, as I said earlier, it is quite a vulnerability. There are quite some space assets, cybersecurity gaps, which governments would not like to reveal in order to not give hackers the opportunity to find out where those vulnerabilities are, let's say. So yeah, I would say up until now, the biggest response was really saying nothing or not reporting them at all. Yeah, and so like on the last part of your questions, yeah, so far it was states on their own which dealt with that, but I would say the strongest response here really came from the private sector side. So obviously states do have their own capacities and capabilities and answering to such attacks. And notably, if we take the United States or if we take the United Kingdom, they already set up quite some defense mechanisms, which is important for their deterrence function as well. But it is really the private sector leading cybersecurity defense these days. And I think that's also the reason why governments are quite dependent upon them. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure.
You had another question, or am I wrong about that, Elena?
Yes, this is just because I know that you have been carrying this research out in terms of, as a non-resident fellow at Nato in Estonia, Tallinn. So it was more related to, not only to space assets, let's say, but to cyber threats in general that, some of the NATO states are experiencing in the last decade or so. And if NATO is equally lagging on that front as well as they do with space assets.
Sorry, could you reformulate your question, please?
Yes, so well, there have been attacks on let's say the Baltic states, for instance, Estonia in the past, which have been linked to Russia. So my question is perhaps if basically, as far as I know, that was not necessarily, I mean, I don't know how it works from a technical point of view in terms of if attack happens, if it's only on space assets or, there are different attacks happening in terms of, like the technical part of it. But I'm wondering if basically there has been a better response from NATO in terms of the different kinds of attacks, cyber attacks that are happening on member states. Because you're talking about, let's say, the space assets, right? Something quite of a new sort of perhaps avenue, but perhaps they have been a little bit more efficient in tackling some of the other avenues that, because like cyber attacks, I mean, they have happened since like 2007 on Estonia, I think, which has been like quite a while ago. So if they have not even solved that, to expect them to sort of take care of some of these new threats seems a little bit, what is your take?
Yes, thank you for the question. Good question. Has NATO been active itself in deterring attacks? That's how I would understand it now. Yes, so like to give a brief answer, as I said, NATO just set up its new Center of Excellence for Space. It is working with the JRPCC, which is also a research center directed at space questions, which does quite a lot in the field. However, NATO itself just recognized space as an operational domain in 2019. So that is one of the answers on those recent space threats and developments. I would say this is also majorly due to reason that ships were attacked in 2018, 2019 during the last big NATO exercise, during which GPS signals of those ships were jammed, and troops majorly relied on those GPS signals as navigational tools. And I think this was kind of like a wake-up call for NATO to actually start doing something in that direction. I don't want to say that this is the reason for why NATO finally recognized space as an operational domain in 2019, or why it finally set up a Center of Excellence for Space last year, becoming operational this year. But I guess it was some sort of a wake-up call. So NATO in itself was not too active so far in responding to attacks, to cyber attacks directed at space assets. There is this whole question around the NATO treaty, Article 5 and 6, what I said earlier, the right to collective defense. NATO can become operative as an alliance if there's an attack on one of the NATO member states. But what do you do in outer space and cyberspace where there are no national frontiers? So this is a huge question. Can NATO even become operational? Apparently, like from one of the discussions that I had throughout the last weeks, at one meeting in 2016, NATO decided that an attack on a nation state in cyberspace on critical infrastructure might be seen as well as an attack, in a sense, on a member state, in a sense that they might collectively respond to that and defend this attack. However, it's not judicially quite clear if NATO could even interact. So I think, responding to your question, the most active response to those attacks came from the member states themselves. And as I said earlier, the private sector. And from the member states itself, we see specifically France and the US, which moved quite a lot. US under Trump, within the Trump period, established now the US Space Force, which started to become quite active in the whole sector, also related to the CMMC, but doing a lot of controls, a lot of regulations. And in France, respectively, being set up exactly at the same moment in 2019, the Armée de l'air et de l'espace française, so also like the French Space Force, which is nice because they are located in Europe. And so this might help quite a bit with aligning European legislation. So within Europe, on a European level, we would have ESA, the European Space Agency. We would have Luxembourg to be extremely active in the field. We would have the UK on the European continent, or like within the European space, let's say, which was quite active in the past and still leads the sector quite a bit. Yeah, I would say that answers your question. It's rather coming from the member states than from NATO itself.
Thank you very much.
Are there further questions?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. So, so please, guys, ask questions, as Berenike has been so kind to grace us with her time. So I have a question, and I'm sorry if it's a very basic one. It's not highly technical. So in 2019, the member states signed this statement: space would become an operational domain, and that's why we, for instance, were interested in your research, and we started looking into the effect that this will have on our work. And quite frankly, and this could be because of my lack of understanding, but I found it quite difficult to get sort of a coherent, unified message on what this means for the member states and how they tend to kind of put it in action, or what changes we can see. So I apologize if it's a very basic question, but I think it might be interesting for at least some of the more sort of enthusiasts that watch our meetings.
Yes, no, excellent question. No, literally excellent question. Thank you so much, Thor, for this, because this is, I think this was like the biggest question throughout the whole Scholar University universe on space. So what? So NATO made space an operational domain. So what? I think it starts very basically with the assumption that that such an international organization as NATO recognizes space as a domain where attacks could happen, and where member state assets can be under threat, i.e. can NATO as an alliance, can member states of NATO rely on other member states to defend them if national satellites get attacked, and therefore national critical infrastructure breaks down, and therefore like a whole country will not be able to function anymore, as we already saw it in the past in Ukraine. So I think this is a quite important step also already to signalize from the deterrence point of view against other countries, other alliances, that if one member state satellite will be attacked or the data connection within it, and this leads to casualties or to the loss of critical infrastructure, then other member states, which includes such forceful member states such as the US or the UK, or also Luxembourg with their space capabilities, I think this sends a pretty strong deterring signal against the attackers that those member states will come after them. So I think this was the basic assumption. Now, on the space policy itself, I think it will just work out same as the cyber recognition in 2016. So in 2016, only NATO recognized cyber as an operational domain. So the space policy just right now, the cyberspace policy just right now, as the space policy itself was written rather general. So like within the policy, you don't want to go too much into detail to not restrict yourself throughout the upcoming years and throughout the assignment of resources, but you just rather would like to get as many countries on board, right? And afterwards, from what I heard throughout the interviews, the real negotiations really started. So this resulted in, for example, right now, the resources spent by the member states to set up the new Center of Excellence, to assign experts, to integrate the whole thing into NATO missions. So I think like one very important point is that just last week, during the 2 last weeks, I participated in the NATO Cyber Center of Excellence locked shield exercise, where they assigned or where they conducted quite the interesting blue and red team simulation exercise. So basically what happened there, just as in every simulation exercise, is that they were given a lot of injects, a lot of scenarios, and this time, for the first time, really, the Space ISAC, the newly set up Space ISAC got involved into that. We developed quite some scenarios directed at data link segments to satellites, and what would happen if they're attacked, GPS spoofing, and what then the member states would have to do in response to such attacks. So the policy in itself brought rather the awareness and the attention to the topic. But what is really the important point is what followed during the past 2 years, and I think it was quite a lot in response to this policy and in response to all the member states' resources which start flowing into that direction right now. And if we take again the cyberspace policy example, the policy itself was rather general to get all those nations on board, but then a lot of more detailed directives came out of that during the past 4 years for cyberspace. And a lot of exercises were conducted and quite some intelligence started to share. So very interesting, everything that happened there. Also very important is that after this policy was not the single document which was drafted, this happened in 2019. But subsequently in 2020, a new memorandum of understanding was signed between NATO, the UK, the US, France, and Italy, which just safeguard 15 years of space asset services for NATO and NATO missions. So the policy was really like the starting point, I would say. But what we observed during the past year and a half was really that member states started to move and NATO started to move to safeguard the frequencies, to safeguard the services retrieved from those space assets, and to try to keep NATO operational for future challenges and requirements. Such as safeguarding SATCOM, broadcast capabilities, and so on and so on. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. A fantastic response, and yeah, it's very reasonable that there is some. It takes some time to develop sort of an actionable plan once you first have to get people on board. Thankfully, we have more questions. So Ted, you're next. I'm gonna ask you to ask it, and please turn on your camera so I can put the spotlight on you. Ted, can you hear us? Yes.
Yeah, morning. Sorry, I'm letting my dog out back real quick. Can you hear me?
Yes. Perfect.
Awesome.
Okay.
So just random question. As far as, the satellite, once it's up in space, it's living its own life. The hardware is up there. We can certainly update the software, but how do we put together policy to defend against the next 15 to 25 years of that satellite's life? Or do we just shut down the hardware and kind of move on?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question, Ted. Extremely relevant question, especially with regards to NATO. But thankfully, NATO is a specialist when it comes to drafting policies generalistic enough to cover like a time frame between 10 to 20 years up to the future and keep the member states on board. Yes, so basically, one major point of the policies, which I will just quickly switch back to the recommendations which I gave there. So I think a very basic point for drafting policies which will be relevant to the next 15 to 20 years once you put up a satellite there in space is that the policy itself, as it was right now, needs to be generalistic enough to keep the countries on board to assign more resources into expertise and into capabilities. So basically, with member states aiming to put up satellites in there, it would be imperative for NATO if NATO envisages to use those services by the member states, to focus in the contract on getting on board before the satellite is even developed or being involved in the development of the satellite. And if that is not possible, so like being involved in a sense that you would try to integrate the private sector regulations, the cybersecurity advice that is given by the private sector to integrate models such as CMMC or the NIST directives. So just to be to be involved in the development process and therefore get a handle of the security of the satellite itself. However, what I think is way more important to NATO these days are satellites operating in LEO. So if we talk about those satellites being out there for 10 to 15 years, we are talking about satellites which are in GEO, so far more away from Earth than satellites being directly above Earth. So satellites being I will try to answer this question in a bit more general manner. So the satellites being that far from Earth that you could not reach out to them for the next 10 to 15 years to change the hardware, let's say, those are the ones being a bit more secure and more stable in a sense. But satellites being installed nearer to Earth might just be more capable or are more capable to deliver data in real time and to get shut up there more easily and to get back, let's say, or to adjust them more easily. So I think like the satellites that NATO will increasingly use in the future, or the services retrieved from those satellites, will rather be those which are nearer to Earth, and therefore which will be more easily to adjust. This is obviously depending on the preferences of the member states. But as we can see, for example, right now with SpaceX or the US satellites being, or the US, the focus of the US on the type of satellites which they're using are rather satellites which are nearer to Earth, and therefore they might be also more easy to adjust and vulnerabilities to fix than those which are traditionally used, which are far more out there. And yeah, to answer to your question, putting that into the policy, the requirement for the open reporting of vulnerabilities, the open reporting of gaps, so member states and their cyber teams can become operational, NATO itself can become operational. And also what you can put into the policy, obviously the intelligence sharing requirement. So for example, using this Space Center of Excellence as an intelligence sharing hub, or also using just the Joint Intelligence Office of NATO, and to fix that point in the policy that this sharing of vulnerabilities and of reporting and of intelligence should become imperative. I think that is something which you could really, really realize. Did I answer your question?
You did, thank you. And I'm actually working on a couple other questions for you real quick. Yeah, that was great, thank you.
Sure.
All right, Ari has a comment and I think he wants you to comment on it. So Ari, you have to unmute your mic so I can put the spotlight on you. And Ted, then you will be next. And I think that's about the time we'll have. Ari. Well, your mic doesn't seem to be working. Okay. So, Tad, would you be willing to take the next question? I'll put it on you.
So I put it in chat, but I'll say it as well. So as far as the various agencies around the world, around the various nations working together, so to speak, why are they fighting so hard to share information with each other? Why? I mean, I understand you don't want to give away, oh, these are my secret tools. But why are they working so hard to say, oh, well, we're perfect, we're not under attack, nobody's attacking us? Why aren't they working more together? And what can we do to enforce or encourage that through policy?
Mm-hmm. So on the cybersecurity side of things, there are actually quite a lot of efforts going on already throughout, or have been developed throughout the past year. So we would have, for example, the MISP framework, where you would share some cyber vulnerabilities, malware, threat actors behind that, where they're located. So the efforts are there. Just on the space sector, which is also due to the fact that it's still young in the sense that a lot of startups are coming up each year. A lot of startups are breaking down each year, which does not really contribute to a continued threat intelligence sharing, let's say. Hinders the whole thing. But starting from the intelligence question, this is very much again directed on the deterrence thought. Nation states are not too eager normally to share their vulnerabilities, and especially if you start sharing vulnerabilities with regards to such critical assets such as space assets, you would always have the trade-off between, do I share my secret information on my vulnerabilities and my gaps and give therefore hackers a hint to where they should hack next? Or do I rather try to keep completely quiet and not share anything, but therefore also might be in danger to just fall behind with development, with innovation, and closing cybersecurity gaps. So I think you have this huge trade-off: deterrence versus, so deterrence and staying safe, but then on the cost of leaving potential gaps open. Also, what we can observe right now very much in the governmental and private sector is that there are not a lot of individual private hackers integrated, so like cybersecurity hacking experts integrated in the whole threat detection process. So throughout the interviews, there was oftentimes the call to integrate private hackers in the satellite and the cybersecurity on satellite development process, just in order to more easily find and close cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the first place. So this is not a new thing to recognize that private hackers, white hat hackers, are constantly underestimated and undervalued throughout the private sector, and rather I would say diminished for doing their work. But throughout the interviews, there was really the call for integrating them in the development of satellites and giving out higher rewards for finding cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So yeah, circling back to your question, why are states reluctant to share their vulnerabilities and to share their intelligence? Because they don't want to give hackers the easy pathway to how they could be hacked, let's say. But obviously this trades off for East cybersecurity deterrence response. I would call it a little bit an arms race in space, to be honest, or an arms race in cyberspace. Nobody really wants to admit their vulnerabilities. Everybody just tries to develop rapidly new tools, new satellites, and therefore the whole cybersecurity consideration just falls down, is not considered enough. Did this answer your question, Ted?
It did. There's a lot going on very often, very fast all over the world. And it's interesting to see who cooperates and who doesn't cooperate and to what extent. And it's interesting to me to kind of listen in and read all these different articles going around the world where, you know, it is a new space, cyberspace, and how people are adapting to it. And then there's still so much to grow into. So I'm really curious about the policies for the future. You know, just the policies today are great, but when, you know, companies like SpaceX start to outgrow just putting satellites into orbit and they do start going to the moon and Mars, etc., then what are we kind of looking at there? But that may be a whole other conversation.
Well, I think like a very important point to make here is also that everything, obviously, due to the whole trade-off which I just described, depends on trust. So the best intelligence sharing so far obviously went on between the Five Eyes, so the English-speaking countries, spearheaded by the US and the UK. And that's also where the most intelligence sharing goes on in the space sector and the cybersecurity vulnerability sector. So intelligence is always depending on trust. And I think this is also why an organization such as NATO is so imperative to maintain it. Not only because it's the only transatlantic organization based on these dimensions and still including the US, which is spearheading the space sector, but also because you just have to split a platform for sharing such sensitive intelligence, and also on a platform to cooperate with other international organizations. So I'm speaking about private sector organizations. I'm speaking about, apparently there was also already collaboration sometimes at a time with Europol, with the platform of experts. So I think an organization such as NATO opens up a lot of threat intelligence sharing possibilities. So yeah, I think it's quite imperative that we keep up this effort and that we stay connected.
It's exciting times coming.
It is indeed.
So we have so Ari is having some issues with his mic, or it isn't getting through. So he sent me a question or a comment that maybe you want to elaborate on. His comment is low orbit satellites have a shorter lifetime as 5-year-olds they are out of date. So, so instead of satellites being made with a 15 years lifetime, the new ones usually have around 5 years. As for security, usually new satellites are sent to space without firmware, so hackers can't copy the software, and the firmware software is run on the satellites. So it's sent to them after space, and it's easy to change what they should do. Yeah, so I guess he's. Yes, we can hear you now. Okay, great.
Cool.
That's fantastic, because
So,
now you can kind of encipher, but the comment
this is
and
so
what you want.
complicated. Hello, everybody there from
Hi,
the
Ari.
sunny Iceland with the beach on the background. So, right, I work with satellites over here in Iceland, this Earth station, and we upload the firmware to the satellite after we have launched them. And they are launched in the US usually, or from Russia. And we send them empty to space without any software, so nobody can hack them. And that I was going to tell you, and I think the same, if we will launch satellite from Iceland, they will go with a low orbit. They will have a short lifetime as well, from the day they will be sent up, they are on the way down to Earth again. But well, it takes 5 years. And as now all the camera, all the CPU, everything on board those small satellites are really out of date just after 5 years. So they are only telecommunication satellites, like sending television that get the 15-year-old lifetime. So I think the satellite that we will launch from here will have a very short lifetime, and they will be on the way to falling to Earth really the same day they are sent out. But of course, that will take some time. So that was really not exactly a comment, well, a question, but I think I can agree with you, Berenike. Well, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. That the whole thing is quite complicated, and what the satellite should do, why is it sent up? Is it a Starlink satellite that is 10,000 satellites? I think only this year alone there are more than 300 being sent up. Or is it a telecommunication satellite where you have an internet? And well, that is again, they are now on a low orbit instead of geostationary orbit, the lower latency. But again, they have a very short lifetime. So you need to send many satellites up, and they are coming quite fast down again. And so I think that kind of satellite will be will be sent from up from Iceland if it will be done. And that was really my idea of not making this too complicated. There will be only low orbit satellite put up in space if we will fire them up from Iceland. So, well, I can speak forever about Nelly, go Ringas Ring. So
yeah. Please
nice
don't
to
do
see
that.
you, everybody,
let's not do that.
and I am just to say hello. I work with this every day, and if don't know, if Berenike know, the Planet Labs take a picture of the Earth once a day of the complete Earth, and I work with them. That is where I work.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And
Thank you for that. Do you? Oh, sorry, Berenike. I was just going to say, do you want to comment on that and maybe what this change signals for space and cybersecurity?
I was just about to. So yes, you're right, Ari. Thank you so much for the comment. Yes, I agree with you. I also think that I think as well that it will be almost only LEO. No, it will be majorly LEO satellites, which will send up into space during the upcoming years, due to obvious reasons, or due to the reasons that we stated before. So yes, I agree with you on the points you made. Very interesting that you sent them up without a software at all. So excited to see how this will work. I didn't really work with that concept so far. However, this kind of relates, like from my point of view, to Ted's question here. The more satellites such as these ones are out there in space, and the more companies get involved, and satellites getting sent up, taken down, sent up, taken down after 5 years already, the harder it will become to actually follow up on vulnerabilities and on gaps, and to share the threat intelligence on that gaps, just because, just due to the fact that so many actors are involved in developing those satellites. And I think therefore also a loss of oversight over those satellites being involved, and the vulnerabilities being included in them. So I think once more, it will become imperative to register vulnerabilities, and also I think to register the satellites which get sent up there. So there are quite some regulations already going on there for that. However, I'm not quite sure in how far the private sector would even agree to being over-regulated, especially over-regulated by an international organization such as NATO. It's already hard to get the member states on board to being restricted through regulations. But then to try to get the private sector on board to be restricted in the innovation and development and installment of small satellites such as the LEO satellites, I think this will be quite a challenge that we will face during the upcoming years. Beside of that, I also heard throughout interviews and throughout the research that it might be oftentimes more expensive to actually install all those cybersecurity controls and requirements if you want to be certified, such as through NIST, than the actual development of the satellites itself these days. So I think this is another challenge which we will face during the upcoming years.
Thank you.
One more thing from me, sorry.
Yes.
As far as that goes, so, you know, I understand imposing more rules from NATO on private party would not be accepted by a lot of folks. But as far as the, development before it's even sent up. So a lot of times we talk about building security in versus bolting security on. So policy, how are we, I guess, rigging that, or how are we wording that in the policies so that it is more built in from the ground up versus just being sent up into space, and then we apply the software that has the security in place based on the NIST or the FIPS or the whatever it is, whatever framework we're utilizing.
Ted, either my internet connection was bad right now, or I didn't really catch your question. Could you just rephrase it for a second, please?
Yeah, if I can remember what it was. So we're building security in from the base, from the foundation, versus bolting it on. Rather, we should be building it in from the foundation instead of bolting it on. So as far as that goes, what kind of policies are implemented to go to manufacturers, I guess, or to schools, students, to build the security in from the ground up before they even apply anything to it when it gets to space?
Yeah, okay, wonderful question. So training and education is quite the big subject in the space sector right now, because there are still not too many masters or bachelor's, masters, like educational training on the nexus between cybersecurity and space specifically. So there are a lot of engineering masters going on, but they're, like, from what I saw so far, maybe new master are right now in the making, but from what is there so far and what I heard is that there is not enough education on this specific nexus, which is not the best precondition for those engineers developing the satellites, obviously. So we do have a huge lag going on there. On the second part of the question, are there already regulations? So from what I saw so far, there is no specific judicial and international framework so far governing the cybersecurity of space assets, which is no wonder, because the whole field is still kind of new, and member states don't want to share their vulnerabilities and all of the above what we just said. There are, however, some regulatory frameworks which I lined out briefly already, but happy to go more into depth with them. So we would have the US spearheaded cybersecurity maturity model certification, which they are imposing right now on their whole supply chain. So everything would come, from my point of view, more from the cybersecurity side right now, right? So because there are already some regulations in place in the private sector, which can be easily adopted for the public sector, and which can also be adopted for the development of satellites. So we would have the CMMC, we would have the ISO guidelines, specifically 27001. We would have the National Aerospace Standard, the AIA Aerospace Standard on critical security controls for effective capability in cyber defense, which might briefly align with the NIST. So already taking the two together would be quite the development, or would be quite the good start for space companies, I would say. Afterwards, DS developed, together with its Space Force, the Memorandum on the Space Policy, Directive 5, which is the cybersecurity principles for space systems. This one was issued on the 4th of September 2020. So it just came out more or less, and needs to be implemented together with the CMMC. As you said, we're living in exciting times, and we're really in the starting phase of this whole development. But I think really the baseline here are NIST, ISO, CMMC, and US Space Policy Directive 5 on cybersecurity. And I think combining those policies and using them already for the development of space assets will give companies quite the good start, a good cyber secure start for the development of satellites. Hopefully this will not cost them too much. Hopefully this will not be more expensive than developing the LEO satellites themselves, because that will obviously undermine motivation. But yeah, it would be a start.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right. Thank you, Berenike. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you speak here, and we've gone quite a bit over time, which is fine, I hope. Well, we look forward to speaking to you again. It was a very interesting research you did, and I'm happy to tell you that we've distributed it to quite a few people here, and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, everyone, for being so active and engaging in questions. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Also from my side, thank you everybody for joining. This was quite a pleasure. I'm also looking forward for having this online. I understood the sun is shining today in Iceland, and so people take off work